I'm a survivor of sexual violence and I've created a book based on my experiences. The images you see while I'm speaking are from that book. As well as being a survivor, I'm a mental health worker, and a lot of the work I do is about supporting other people to tell their stories in one form or another. I'm going to talk about the environment we share our stories in, what it has been like for me to do that via my book, why it feels important to me to share my experience, and what we might do to support others to share their experiences. There is a conflict between survivors' desires to speak out, organisations that are asking people to do this, and the circumstances we are asking people to speak out in. One of the things that prompted me to start drawing and writing was the increased media coverage of sexual violence over the last few years, including reporting on high-profile cases like Jimmy Savile, the Rochdale and Oxford grooming gangs, and Ched Evans. This increased coverage may be a sign that sexual violence is not being ignored and swept under the carpet, which is great, but as a survivor I have found being bombarded by this in the media really difficult. I have felt there has been no reprieve and no space. This is particularly true where I have been faced with victim-blaming media, where survivors' voices have been absent, or where survivors seem to be being exploited to sell newspapers. Many of the headlines from the last few years have made me furious, and I want to be part of challenging the types of victim blaming I have seen. As a survivor, it also makes me furious that while it is estimated there are between 430,000 and 517,000 victims of sexual offences in the UK every year, there are only between 60 and 95,000 convictions, not to mention the terrible Ched Evans retrial. If I can use my voice to influence this in any way, then I will do this. Survivors' voices are vital. It is important they are heard and important they have influence. It can also be a positive and empowering process for survivors, depending on where the power lies in the process. My book began initially with me drawing and painting pictures of my experience and feelings to try and externalise them, understand them and make sense of them. Then it was about not wanting to be silent. For me, I think silence comes from fear and shame, so speaking out is a rejection of that. More recently, it is also about wanting to let others know they are not alone, about saying clearly that what those men did was not okay. Part of me is still terrified that if I talk about what happened to me, then something really bad will happen. It's like a nameless, all-consuming terror. Sometimes I feel shame or self-blame, even when I know the shame and blame does not belong to me. I am very aware that many survivors speak and have influence as professionals, but don't identify themselves as survivors. This was one of the things I considered when I was thinking about whether I would publish my book in my name. In a climate of increasing professionalisation of services, it seems it is seen as unprofessional and disempowering to be out as a survivor. What messages are we being given that make us feel like this? Is it about survivors' voices not being valued? There seems to be no acknowledgement that individuals can have multiple identities, roles and contributions that they can make. This is a loss. It suggests that being a survivor is seen as a weakness, not a strength. In my case, I was also worried about other people using my experience for their agenda. When I was a teenager, most but not all of the perpetrators against me were Asian men. I wanted to share aspects of this in the light of the things that were said about Rochdale and Oxford. But it was important to me that when I share my experience, I do this in a way that cannot be used by people like the EDL for their agenda. And then there's what happens when we do share our experiences. We live in a society where many people just don't want to hear or know about sexual violence, so there is always the possibility if we share our story, we will not be heard, our experience will be denied or minimised, or we will be blamed. Some people will blame or judge survivors for being victimised, and then again for talking about it. When I told one person that I was writing a book about CSE based on my experience, he said that people would judge me. As much as I know this is an appalling response, I also know that it is true that this person was judging me. Why open myself up to that? I shared the initial version of my book on social media. This was then shared by other people, so over 250 people saw it, many of whom I don't know personally, but who live in the same town as me. Of the people who viewed it, about 10 people responded. Those 10 people made me feel heard, acknowledged, valued and loved. Many of their responses made me cry in a good way. A couple of people gave me a hug when they saw me, which was really nice. I interpreted the silence of the other 240 plus people as them wanting me to be silent, not believing me or them judging me. I guess that really isn't what all those 240 plus people thought, but I think this does highlight the importance of acknowledging survivors' stories. Some people stopped being able to look at me or meet my eyes. Some people started avoiding me. Presumably they were uncomfortable or didn't know what to say, but saying nothing has an impact. One person who I had thought was a friend used what I had shared as an excuse and a means to attack me. Not physically, but in a really horrible way, which was very difficult and frightening. But good things happened too. Two family members saw what I had shared and I got an acknowledgement about what it was like. Someone who works in the police investigating CSE showed it to some of her colleagues and said that it helped them understand better how hard it is for young people to tell. She said it would help them in the way they worked with victims. In the end, the result of sharing felt positive to me. I remember walking around town feeling whole, feeling like I'd stopped silencing myself and stopped denying parts of myself and my experience. I felt more joined up. I felt lighter, like I was carrying less. I also felt like maybe I had impacted in a little way on how other victims would be treated in the future. As someone whose day job involves supporting people to share their stories, it has felt very odd to be sharing my own story for a change. It has really reminded me how frightening that can be and how vulnerable it can make people feel. It has also made me think more about how we support survivors practically, politically, emotionally, in ways that give them power and influence, but which don't damage them, put them at risk or make them vulnerable. On a practical level, we need to provide opportunities for survivors to share their experiences in ways that work for them. For me, this was drawing and painting. Other people prefer writing or talking. If there are some people we can't hear, then we need to change how we are listening, not force them to tell in a particular way. We need to support survivors to set the agenda, not just be consulted on things. We need to be open to hearing what survivors have to say, whether they say what you want them to or not. We need to provide different settings for survivors to share their experiences in. We need to provide a platform. We need to recognise that survivors will want to share in different ways and to different degrees at different times. We mustn't make people feel that they have to share or make them feel guilty for not sharing. We need to be flexible. We need to acknowledge the dangers of sharing experiences in some settings. Sometimes it can support survivors to feel heard if they're able to talk about sexual violence generally, if they can quote statistics and things like that. We need to give people information and support them to do this if this is what they want to do. It can be a way of speaking out without having to use your own experience. However, I think it's also important that this general information is not seen as more important than the understanding and learning that we can get when individuals or groups of survivors share their own personal experiences. Finally, we need to show we have heard survivors when they've shared experiences. By that I don't just mean acknowledging it, I mean acting on it, making changes, and then letting survivors know what they've influenced and had an impact on. Thank you.